Greetings again, tuberistas. I knew I'd run out of time. As longtime perusers who drop by this channel know, I have made a few videos on the Cuban Revolution over the years, and so there's really naught that's original in what I've said, except that it contradicts the views of the American mainstream across the acceptable political spectrum, from right to liberal. Without being an official regime apologist, it's only just to present the officially repressed other side. Repressed by the United States, that is, not totalitarian Cuba, just as it was not Cuba, but the United States government that prohibited U.S. citizens from traveling there, largely because of the propaganda influence of the old New Left group, Fair Play for Cuba. Maybe a cover for dirty dealings in Dallas? Because tuberistas, though we're often told that conspiracy theories are crazy and that the simplest answer is the best answer, we know from experience that life is not always, if ever, a simple process. Anyway, to continue our thread on the conversion of Cuba to communism, first I will pause for a glass of refreshing beverage from my imperialist container, which I may periodically do from time to time as we proceed. Or as President Kennedy said, while we would prefer decent democratic regimes, if the choice is between a Castro or a traditional dictator, we will prefer the traditional dictator. Which means if Castro's early neutralism was really a cover for and proof of communism, then the U.S. obsession with communism and anti-Americanism can also be taken as cover and evidence of Yankee imperialism, even if Cuba's state sovereignty as such was formally respected. So as demonstrated by the record tuberistas, this North American-Cuban hostility predates any controversies over Marx or Lenin and was rooted in power interests. Fidel's brother Raul, number 2 man and eventual revolutionary heir, said the land reform of 1959 was the Rubicon of our revolution, a death sentence for our U.S. relations. At that moment there was no discussion about socialism or Cuba dealing with Russia, but the die was cast. Thus we can't rob Castro of his revolutionary initiative and portray his actions as mere reflex to U.S. action. By moving forward socially, preferring not to use the dread word socialist, by not restoring business as usual under a democratic facade, the revolution was bound to butt head-on with a neo-colonial Yankee presence embedded in the very structure of things. From this the embargoes, sabotage, U.S.-backed terrorism, assassination plots, invasions followed dialectically, as well as Castro's nationalizations, turning to the Soviets and putting their ballistic missiles on his sovereign soil. Castro expressed his freedom to choose. He just chose the wrong side, like other voters in free elections, as in Chile. And this is in keeping with the fact that throughout the 20th century, communism came to power through war, wars that invariably communists did not start. The United States vindicated Marxism in Cuba. On one hand, the thesis of Castro's revolution against Batista dictatorship and its corrupt old order. On the other, the antithesis of the American counter-revolutionary war on Castro, leading to the very synthesis of revolution and communism the U.S. so lamented. Or did it, really? In truth, this seemed the very result the U.S. preferred. By mid-1959, the Assistant Secretary of State Roy Rubottom was echoing Raul Castro, that there were indications that Fidel was not a man we could do business with, that it was time to shift from the testing phase, in which Castro had failed practically every test we had given him, to the pressure phase. The approved program authorizes us, he said, to support elements in Cuba opposed to the Castro government, while making Castro's downfall seem to be the result of his own mistakes. While CIA Director Allen Dulles privately told the British ambassador in November 1959, 3 months before the first Soviet trade deal or any visit by Soviet representatives, that he hoped to force Castro to buy arms from the Soviet bloc because, as in Guatemala in 1954, it had been such a shipment of Soviet weapons, light arms such as rifles, pistols, and grenades, that had created the occasion for what had been done, the CIA-backed overthrow of that government, and the same might be true in the case of Cuba. Because, by driving Castro toward Moscow by economic strangulation and inciting civil war, his responses could be used against him, to back him into a corner, to strip him of his annoying humanist neutralism as proof he was an outright enemy all along. And so the Soviets armed him to come out of his corner, fighting till the day they pulled the plug, turning his wartime letter to Celia Sanchez into a self-fulfilling prophecy. the nationalizations, crackdowns on civil rights, organizing the committees in defense of the revolution, all of it makes practical military sense as tactics for homeland security, destroying the economic and social power of his fifth column. Even the Great Literacy Drive of 1961, sending alphabetizing students as teachers into the farthest, most forgotten corners of the island, had its military underside to keep tabs on rural fifth columnists in remote areas where CIA counter-revolutionaries were operating most freely. It was hoped Castro's desperate retaliatory measures would cut off revolutionary Cuba from any regional sympathy among mainstream Latin Americans, although, just to be sure, there should be more military coups overthrowing elected governments, as would follow all through the 1960s and 70s. At no time during this plot to restore democracy in Cuba had the U.S. taken any steps to do so during the Batista years, when its leverage was at its peak. Despite all the preaching of balance over bullets as the American way, the United States' original anti-Castro crusade never moved beyond defining democracy as protecting the class interests of U.S. investors of the old Cuban propertied elites. No idea of creating any constructive cross-class sympathy by reminding Castro supporters, largely poor, that the poor man is the one most in need of civil rights and freedom from coercion in any system, who need his humble private property protected more than the poor working man and the peasant. That property can also mean property and labor, as well as real estate or capital assets. In this era of democratization and color-coded so-called revolutions, it's ironic that Washington couldn't motivate Cubans of color to look to U.S. democratic processes to redress their specific feelings of alienation, when the U.S. was ambivalent about the same issue for its own citizens of color. Only later, in the late Soviet era, did the U.S. push to help democratic dissidents, or even help create them. Even so, the appeal to the average Cuban to see these ideals as personally relevant to his life remains hamstrung by middle-class definitions and interpretations from which the majority were excluded before 1959 after over a half-century of North American example. So, what did the U.S. ever learn about itself through this decades-long debacle 90 miles from its territorial waters? Why, Tubaneros? You guessed it, not a damn thing. The defeat in Cuba was to lead to defeat in Vietnam and its equivalent in Iraq and now in Afghanistan. Maggie Thatcher said after the Cold War, there is no alternative, the Tina Doctrine. Well, there's no evidence that the alternative future the U.S. had planned for Cuba during the Cold War would have provided any better history than the one which developed under Castro, and likely much worse. Castro may have fought his Cold War to maintain power. But what alternative were the U.S. and the anti-Castro plotters offering? A real hot civil war, with the utter island-wide devastation of Cuba's infrastructure, much worse than the localized revolutionary war of the late 50s, ending in foreign occupation and sheer reprisals against anyone deemed a feudalista or a communist. There had been no denunciations of those post-Bay of Pigs firing squads, you may be sure. Once again, there was no real passion for democracy, freedom, and human rights for Cuba coming out of Washington until after Castro's victory, until after any possible leverage the U.S. could have had over Cuba was repudiated, because of course the real interests of the U.S. and Cuba were not at stake before, no matter how many of the torturable class were sacrificed. In relation to the U.S. power system, Castro was a dissident voice that it tried to shut up. He was not a clueless rebel without a cause who could be safely trundled out of the picture like James Dean, but a shrewd and highly motivated one. All those who directly challenged the traditional hierarchies within or within reach of U.S. power were treated just like the USSR stepped on Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, or like Valenza. There is a straight line of denunciation, demonization, and defamation in the U.S. system from Emma Goldman to W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., to Malcolm X and Castro and Guevara, often leading to exile, assassination, or attempted assassination to shut them up for popping the Capitol Dome's bubble of consensus. This rejection was so complete that there was no possibility of restoring basic diplomatic relations while Fidel remained in power, even a generation after the end of the USSR and the Cold War. Even after his last 8 years of official retirement and disability, he had to physically pass away in toto before the U.S. State Department, White House, and Congress could even consider reopening a full diplomatic presence in Havana. Only then could there be normalization. But the unasked question in Washington is what, in the context of mutual history, mutual consent, normalization actually represents. Because even now, with Fidel and his Ashburn, there still seems problems in ending the U.S.-Cuban Cold War and recognizing who was master. Not that we don't know the real answer to that any less than you do. No matter how long I ramble on, it always comes. That hotline call from the cyber ether. All right. Hello? You're who? Benito Juarez? The 19th century Mexican revolutionary? You're a bit before our time here at hand, Hefe, but you think you have the answer to the question, like when you fought the Emperor Maximilian imposed on Mexico by France. Well, all right, I still have battery time, I think, so let's hear it. You got a personal letter from Emperor Max, Napoleon III's Batista, saying you and he both stood for the same thing. Said if you'd only laid down your arms, he'd grant civil liberties, human rights, the rule of law, even elections. But in the end, you told him no, and rejected him and had him shot. But why? Because there was one thing he could not grant, that wasn't in his power to grant, the essence of which you were fighting over. Your country's right to govern itself.